The village of St. Mary Mead had long been a place where time moved slowly, its streets lined with neat cottages and flower-filled gardens, where the scent of freshly baked bread often lingered in the air. Life was simple, and for the residents, the most exciting events were typically the local tea parties, the occasional village fair, and the comforting rhythm of daily routines. But nothing had prepared them for the sudden and shocking disruption that would occur one bright afternoon in early summer. The fete, held annually in the village's large green park, was always an occasion to look forward to. Tables adorned with homemade cakes, jars of strawberry jam, and pots of fresh tea drew crowds, while children played games and laughter echoed through the air. The village band performed cheerfully in the background, and Miss Marple, as usual, had been invited to sit in the shade and watch the festivities. She had no intention of partaking in the various games or contests, but was content to observe the goings-on with her usual quiet interest. Her presence, like that of so many other elderly residents, was a fixture of these events, and her sharp eyes missed little. On this particular occasion, however, there was an air of nervousness about the gathering. The villagers were all aware that this year's fete marked a momentous occasion. Lady Evelyn, the wealthy widow who had recently moved into the large manor at the edge of the village, had agreed to make a rare public appearance. There was much speculation about her, as she had kept mostly to herself since arriving, and everyone was eager to catch a glimpse of the enigmatic new arrival. Lady Evelyn, a tall and striking woman, had arrived earlier in the day, accompanied by her aloof but equally striking niece, Caroline. The two women had been greeted by murmurs of admiration as they made their way to the main event, their delicate features and poised expressions marking them as outsiders in this close-knit community. Miss Marple observed them from her vantage point under a large oak tree. She had no particular interest in the newcomers, but had already noticed that Lady Evelyn seemed to hold herself with an air of superiority, while Caroline appeared much more at ease, chatting easily with the villagers around her. As the afternoon wore on, the mood remained festive, but there was a slight tension hanging in the air. It was during the children's race, as the excited chatter reached its peak, that the first hint of trouble arose. The scream was unmistakably a piercing cry that sliced through the merriment like a knife. In an instant, the atmosphere shifted from one of joyful celebration to shock and confusion. Heads turned, and people rushed towards the source of the sound. Miss Marple, though startled, remained calm. Her years of experience had taught her that human nature often revealed itself in moments of crisis. She watched as several villagers dashed towards the scene, and others stood frozen, unsure of what to do. It was only when they reached the spot that the horrific discovery was made. Lady Evelyn's body was found lying motionless on the grass, her face a pale mask of shock, her eyes wide open. Her once immaculate gown, adorned with lace and fine embroidery, was now stained with blood. The crowd gasped, and the music from the band came to an abrupt halt. It was clear that something had gone terribly wrong. As the murmurs of disbelief spread, Miss Marple slowly stood from her seat, and with the careful grace of one who had seen many such tragedies in her long life, made her way toward the growing crowd. She had seen enough to know that this was no accident. Someone in that group had killed Lady Evelyn, and the murderer was among them. The local constable, a young man named Mr. Giles, arrived shortly after the discovery, his face pale with shock. He quickly took charge of the situation, attempting to keep the onlookers at bay. His voice, though authoritative, betrayed his anxiety as he ordered the area cleared. As the crowd dispersed and the police began their work, Miss Marple remained on the outskirts of the gathering. The sound of the band's lively tune drifted across the village green, blending with the chatter of the crowd and the occasional squeal of children racing about the field. As always, the fete was a charming, though somewhat predictable, event. Stalls offering homemade jam, freshly squeezed lemonade, and carefully sewn quilts stood in neat rows, while villagers milled about, exchanging pleasantries and admiring each other's handiwork. For Miss Marple, it was just another pleasant afternoon, spent among friends, tucked away in the corner of a bustling, sunlit world. Yet, as she sat quietly in her usual spot by the flower stall, her sharp eyes watching the movements of the crowd, with more than idle curiosity, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was amiss. There was an undercurrent to the atmosphere that, while undetectable to most, seemed clear to her. A subtle tension hung in the air, like the calm before a storm. She couldn't explain it, not exactly, but it was there. Miss Marple sipped her tea, thoughtfully, watching the villagers go about their business. The children's laughter echoed in the distance as they chased one another, but the pleasantness of the day seemed only skin-deep. Something was wrong, and it wasn't just the growing sense of unease that had settled over her. Across the green, the Honourable Violet Drew, wife of the local landowner, was making her way toward the refreshment table with her usual air of dignified superiority. She held herself like a queen among her subjects, her nose slightly raised, her pearls gleaming in the sunlight. Miss Marple had observed the woman many times before, noting her tendency to ignore others unless it was to make a pointed remark about their station or manners. But today, Violet's usual airs were more pronounced than ever. There was something in the way she moved, her eyes darting nervously about the crowd, that piqued Miss Marple's curiosity. It wasn't long before the first sign of trouble emerged. "Did you hear?" whispered Martha Gillingham, a familiar face in the village, to a group of women seated nearby. The whisper was low but still carried. "The organist is missing. They can't find him anywhere. No one knows where he's gone." The gossip quickly spread like wildfire, with the crowd murmuring in confusion. The organist, a somewhat solitary man named Leonard Pippin, had been a fixture at the village fete for years, his music lending an air of charm and tradition to the event. To suddenly find him absent, especially without explanation, seemed suspicious. Miss Marple, whose hearing was as sharp as ever, caught snippets of conversations about it, but she made no comment. Her gaze remained steady, her mind working, assessing the unfolding situation with practiced calm. The fete continued, but the murmur of unease never quite dissipated. The children's laughter grew quieter, as though the weight of the missing organist hung over them, stealing away some of their innocence. It was only when a shriek broke the uneasy silence that Miss Marple's attention snapped back to the crowd. She looked toward the source of the commotion, her eyes narrowing. A woman who she soon recognized as Edith Sims, the local schoolteacher, was pointing toward the flower stall, her face contorted in a mix of horror and disbelief. The woman was visibly trembling, and as Miss Marple followed her gaze, she understood the cause of her distress. There, beneath the brightly colored blooms, lying in an untidy heap on the ground, was the body of Leonard Pippin. His face was pale, his expression frozen in a grotesque mask of shock. He had been struck down, that much was certain, but the manner of his death remained unclear. It was impossible to know from this distance, but the very sight of him, lying there amidst the flowers as if part of the display, sent a chill through the crowd. The festive atmosphere shattered in an instant. People screamed, their voices rising in a cacophony of shock and panic. Some rushed toward the body, while others stood frozen, unable to process the grim reality of the scene before them. The fete, once a symbol of cheer, now seemed a distant memory, replaced by a sense of terror and disbelief. In the midst of the chaos, Miss Marple remained calm, observing the reaction of the villagers as they surged toward the lifeless figure. Within moments, Constable James Grant appeared, his face pale but composed. He had been off duty, mingling with the crowd when the body had been discovered, but now he took charge with a quiet authority. He instructed the villagers to step back and clear the area, his voice carrying over the confusion. Miss Marple noticed how his eyes darted about, looking to others for confirmation, as though seeking guidance. It was clear that the constable was overwhelmed by the situation. He had dealt with minor incidents in the village before, but nothing like this. "Please, everyone, step back," Grant called again, his voice shaking slightly as he attempted to maintain order. "Give the body some space. No one is to touch anything." Despite his efforts, the villagers were not so easily subdued. Whispers ran rampant, and a sense of panic began to ripple through the crowd. It wasn't just the death that frightened them, it was the question of who could have done such a thing, and why. Miss Marple stood silently in the background, taking in every detail of the scene. The shock of Leonard Pippin's death seemed to have affected everyone. But it was the villagers' reactions that most intrigued her. It was always the same. In the face of sudden death, people became like children, their emotions raw and their thoughts unguarded. It was these moments that often revealed the truth, hidden beneath layers of social niceties and careful restraint. As she stood there, observing the confusion around her, Miss Marple felt a stirring in her mind. The death of Leonard Pippin was no accident, she was certain of that, and in a village like St. Mary Mead, where everyone knew everyone else's business, the question of motive was as important as the question of means. She would need to watch the people closely, listen to the whispers, and see where the threads of the mystery lead. The first murmurs of suspicion began to take shape. Some speculated that Pippin had been caught up in a quarrel, while others wondered if his disappearance earlier that afternoon had been the result of some personal issue. There was even talk of a romantic entanglement, a suggestion that Leonard might have been involved with someone who had something to hide. But no one had concrete answers, only more questions. Miss Marple, however, had no intention of rushing to conclusions. She knew from long experience that the truth always came out, but only when the time was right. For now, she would remain an observer, carefully noting the reactions of those around her, listening for clues in the conversations and gestures of the villagers. As the constable began his initial inquiries, Miss Marple quietly moved through the crowd, her eyes and ears open, searching for that one fleeting detail that might reveal more than the villagers realized. The fete had promised to be a day of celebration, but now, with a body on the ground and suspicion hanging thick in the air, Miss Marple knew that the game was afoot, and she would be ready. The villagers, meanwhile, remained oblivious to the quiet strength of the woman among them, as she subtly observed them, her mind already piecing together the puzzle. The mystery of Leonard Pippin's death was only just beginning, but Miss Marple had a feeling that it was going to be far more complicated than anyone could have anticipated. The village had descended into an uneasy silence following the discovery of Leonard Pippin's body. The once vibrant atmosphere of the fete had been replaced by a grim atmosphere, as the shock of the event lingered in the minds of the villagers. St. Mary Mead, which had always been a place where the simplest of pleasures were enough to sustain its inhabitants, now seemed like a fragile facade, hiding darker realities. The unspoken thought among the villagers was clear. The peace they had so long enjoyed had been shattered, and something sinister had taken root. Miss Marple, however, remained calm. While the others fretted and speculated, she quietly observed the proceedings, making her way through the crowd with a practiced grace. Her age had given her the luxury of blending into the background, unnoticed by most, as she moved from one conversation to another, gathering fragments of information. She would not allow the panic and chaos that surrounded the crime to cloud her judgment. What was required now was the steady and methodical investigation of the people involved, and Miss Marple had no intention of rushing into anything. Constable Grant had summoned the villagers to detectives. Inspector Blakely from the nearby town and Sergeant Thompson, his assistant, both of whom had arrived to take charge of the investigation. They were both men of experience, though Blakely had a tendency to overestimate the importance of his own opinions. Miss Marple watched as the two officers gathered near Leonard Pippin's body, exchanging their initial impressions of the scene. The constable had already outlined his observations for them, his voice shaky but his words firm. "There's no sign of struggle, no indication of forced entry or a scuffle," he reported, standing awkwardly beside the body. "It looks like he simply collapsed here. No obvious wounds, either. I don't understand how it could have happened. It's as though he dropped dead in his tracks." Miss Marple, listening closely, noted the lack of suspicion in the constable's voice. It was as though the death of Leonard Pippin had still not fully registered with him, as though he were unable to reconcile the image of a man who had been, up until a few moments ago, alive and participating in the day's festivities, with the pale and lifeless figure now lying before them. Inspector Blakely, a stocky man with a face that was more accustomed to hard stares than gentle smiles, seemed unfazed by the situation. He scrutinized the body with the practiced eye of a man who had dealt with countless deaths. But there was something in his manner that made Miss Marple wary. His investigation felt rushed, almost as though he was already closing his mind to possibilities. "Clearly, there's no obvious cause of death," Blakely murmured, bending over the body, "but I believe it's safe to assume that this is a case of natural causes or something, accidental. There's no reason to suspect foul play." Miss Marple's sharp eyes caught the slight hesitation in the inspector's words. She knew enough about people to understand that the inspector's reluctance to entertain the possibility of murder was more about a desire for simplicity than anything else. The inspector was eager to close the case with minimal fuss, to restore order to the village as quickly as possible. He had not yet considered that the death of Leonard Pippin could be part of something far more complicated than a sudden, unexplained incident. "Accidental?" Sergeant Thompson asked skeptically, adjusting his hat. "But what about the fact that he was found in such an unusual position? The flowers, how could that be accidental?" Blakely waved the comment away dismissively, clearly impatient. "Let's not overcomplicate things, Thompson. We'll have an autopsy done, and the rest will follow." He stood up straight, brushing off his jacket. "I'd wager that we're dealing with a simple heart attack or some such thing. Pippin was a bit of an odd fellow, wasn't he?" Miss Marple noted the casual tone in which Blakely referred to Leonard Pippin, but she also noted the slight uncertainty in his voice. It was clear to her that Blakely was not entirely confident in his conclusion. She had seen such haste before, a desire to put a neat end to something that felt too disordered for comfort. The inspector's theory seemed too convenient, too dismissive of the peculiarities of the scene before them. Indeed, Pippin was an odd fellow, Miss Marple remarked softly, stepping closer to the group. Her voice was like a gentle breeze, a contrast to the tension in the air. "But I think you'll find that his oddness was not the only thing to consider." Blakely turned to her, his eyebrows raised in mild surprise. "Oh, "And what would you suggest, Miss Marple?" Miss Marple's eyes met his with calm certainty, though her expression remained one of quiet thought. "I suggest, Inspector, that you look closely at the details you've overlooked. It's often the smallest clues that reveal the most." Blakely's gaze flicked over the old woman with a mixture of respect and faint amusement. "Of course, I'll be sure to do that," he replied, though the sarcasm in his tone was evident. He clearly saw Miss Marple's suggestion as nothing more than a polite suggestion. Nothing more, as the inspector and sergeant moved to gather more information. Miss Marple allowed herself a moment to think. What had truly caught her attention was the way Leonard Pippin's body had been found propped up against the flower stall as though he had collapsed there on his own. But with none of the signs that typically accompanied such a sudden event. There had been no outcry, no signs of distress. It was as if he had been placed there. But by whom? And for what reason? Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of raised voices behind her. Miss Marple turned to see Violet Drew, the wife of the local landowner, speaking in an agitated tone to Constable Grant. "I simply don't understand it, James. Leonard was always so harmless, so kind." Violet's voice was tight with emotion, though her expression held none of the rawness Miss Marple might have expected. Instead, it was more of an upper-class discomfort, as if Violet were struggling to reconcile her emotions with her image. "Are you sure this wasn't some sort of accident? Surely that makes more sense." Grant, though well-meaning, looked at Violet with a hint of confusion. "Mrs. Drew," Violet cut him off. "He couldn't have been murdered. Not Leonard. He was harmless, I tell you." She turned to the crowd, casting a quick glance over her shoulder. "Has anyone heard anything? Does anyone know who might have Miss Marple, ever so observant?" Noticed the way Violet's gaze darted around the crowd, scanning faces as though she were searching for someone or something. There was a nervousness to her movements that suggested she might know more than she was letting on. "Perhaps you would be better served staying calm." "Mrs. Drew," Miss Marple said gently, stepping closer. Her tone was reassuring but measured. "We'll know more soon enough, I'm sure." Violet stiffened at the sound of Miss Marple's voice but offered a strained smile. "Yes, of course. Thank you, Miss Marple." As Violet turned away, Miss Marple's keen eyes followed her every movement. There was something off about the woman's behavior, something that didn't sit right with Miss Marple. Was Violet truly so upset by the death of Leonard Pippin? Or was there something else at play here? The quiet suspicion in Miss Marple's mind began to grow, and she knew that the answers would not come easily. But Miss Marple had patience. She would let the villagers reveal their truths in time. For now, her task was simple: to observe, to listen, and to wait for the moment when the mystery would finally unfold before her. The hours following Leonard Pippin's death were marked by a restless energy that filled the village. St. Mary Mead had always been a place where the ordinary carried a certain charm, where tea was served promptly at 4 o'clock, where children played in gardens, and where gossip, though frequent, was always harmless. But now, even the most trivial conversation seemed strained, as though the very air was thick with suspicion. As evening descended and the Fates festivities were slowly dismantled under the watchful eyes of the police, Miss Marple took a quiet walk through the village. The shadows grew longer, and the once bustling streets of St. Mary Mead seemed eerily silent. She walked at a deliberate pace, not hurried but not meandering either, letting her mind wander over the events of the day. She had always believed in the importance of listening, and, as she walked past cottages and gardens, she couldn't help but overhear snippets of conversation carried on the evening breeze. "I tell you, it's that Violet Drew," one voice whispered. "She's hiding something. I can feel it. Another voice, a man's this time, responded. Violet drew. She was the first to raise a fuss about Leonard. Not like her to be so emotional, is it? Miss Marple paused. Her attention piqued. Violet drew. She had already noted something odd in the way the landowner's wife had behaved at the scene, and now, it seemed, the rest of the village was beginning to think the same. But what was the reason for her agitation? Was it genuine concern, or was there something more beneath the surface? She continued her walk, her thoughts shifting to the scene of the crime itself. While the police had been focused on the body, Miss Marple had seen something they hadn't. The flowers at Leonard Pippin's side, the position in which he had collapsed. It all seemed too neat, too convenient. It wasn't a simple accident. But who would benefit from Leonard's death? And why, in such a quiet village, would someone risk committing a murder so openly? Miss Marple's musing was interrupted by the sound of footsteps behind her. Turning, she saw Inspector Blakely approaching, his broad frame cutting through the gathering dusk. He looked weary, but there was an unmistakable gleam of determination in his eyes. Though Miss Marple was often content to let events unfold at their own pace, she knew the inspector's impatience would lead him to draw conclusions far too quickly. He would need guidance and, perhaps, a little redirection. Miss Marple, see you're out for a stroll, Blakely said, his tone friendly but with the faintest edge of authority. I was just looking for you. Well, Inspector, there's only so much one can learn by remaining indoors, Miss Marple replied with a smile, her voice light and pleasant. One must observe the world around her to understand what's truly happening. Blakely smiled thinly. Ah, yes, I'm sure that's true. I've just been speaking with the constable, and we've narrowed down our list of suspects. Miss Marple raised an eyebrow, her curiosity piqued. Narrowed them down, you say? Indeed, Blakely said, pausing to take a breath. We've got a couple of names, and we're investigating their backgrounds. The first, of course, is Violet Drew. Violet Drew? Miss Marple echoed. The landowner's wife. Blakely nodded. She seemed awfully upset, don't you think? A bit too upset, if you ask me. And you know how it is with these people. Money, land, power. There's always something to gain, isn't there? Miss Marple's mind turned over the idea. Violet Drew was certainly a woman of wealth and position. But was that enough of a motive for murder? The landowning families in St. Mary Mead were often subject to their own set of petty squabbles, but to resort to murder over a minor conflict seemed out of character. Then again, Miss Marple reminded herself, nothing in this world was truly predictable. Blakely continued, his eyes scanning the quiet streets. Violet wasn't the only one, though. There's also her husband, Basil Drew. A bit of a character, I hear, quite a few debts hanging over him. Could be a motive there as well. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully, allowing Blakely to continue his analysis. She had to admit, it made sense. The Drews were prominent figures in the village, and their financial troubles could indeed provide a motive for something more drastic. But still, something about this theory felt off, as though the pieces didn't quite fit. I see, Miss Marple said after a pause, but surely there's more to this than a simple financial dispute. Violet Drew may have her own reasons to be upset, but she didn't strike me as someone who would resort to violence. Blakely raised an eyebrow. You think she's innocent? I think there's more to it than meets the eye, Miss Marple replied gently. There are many motives to consider, Inspector, and sometimes the simplest explanation is the hardest to see. Blakely gave her a tight smile, clearly less impressed with her caution than he was with his own conclusions. I'll bear that in mind, he said, turning toward the village square. For now, I'm going to speak with the servants. It seems Leonard was quite close to a few of them, especially his housekeeper, Mrs. Blanchard. She's been with him for years. Miss Marple didn't answer immediately. She was already thinking ahead, her mind circling back to the village fete itself. It had been a social event, a time for the villagers to show off their finery, their status, and perhaps, most importantly, their connections. But in a small village like St. Mary Mead, these connections could just as easily be fraught with resentment as with affection. She had already noted the tense exchange between Violet, Drew, and Mrs. Pippin, Leonard's widow, earlier in the day. Could there have been some deeper animosity at play here? Perhaps something more personal than money. "I think you're on the right track with the servants," Miss Marple finally said, "but you might want to pay closer attention to Leonard's interactions with the people around him. He wasn't as well liked as he seemed, you know." Blakely glanced at her, his curiosity piqued. "Oh, do tell." Miss Marple paused for a moment, considering her words carefully. "Not everyone is as they appear, Inspector Pickle. People often wear masks in public, especially those who appear most harmless. Leonard Pippin was a man of subtle habits, and it's those habits that might tell us more than anything else." Blakely frowned, clearly not understanding the full import of her words. But Miss Marple could see the wheels turning in his mind, and she knew he would soon begin to question the people in Leonard's life more thoroughly. As Blakely turned to leave, Miss Marple lingered for a moment longer, watching the inspector's retreating figure. She had not yet formed a clear picture of the crime, but she could feel the layers of deception closing in around her. There were many players in this drama, and each one had something to hide. She glanced up at the pale moon, now rising over the village rooftops. The night had only just begun, but already she felt the weight of the mystery pressing down on her, urging her to make the connections that would reveal the truth. And Miss Marple, as always, would find the way. She just had to listen carefully and watch closely. The game was afoot. The morning after Leonard Pippin's death was crisp and clear, the sun casting long shadows across St. Mary Mead as the village stirred to life. There was an unnatural quietness in the air, a heaviness that seemed to settle over the cobblestone streets and neat row houses. Even the birds, usually a constant presence in the mornings, seemed to have retreated into the trees, leaving an eerie calm that mirrored the unease felt by the villagers. Miss Marple had, of course, been awake for hours. Her routine was always the same: a quiet cup of tea, a leisurely breakfast, and time spent reflecting on the events of the previous day. She'd spent the morning already visiting the site of Leonard's death again, revisiting the scene with a more critical eye. Inspector Blakely had done his best to assure the villagers that the investigation was proceeding. But there was no mistaking the growing undercurrent of fear. No one was entirely comfortable with the notion that such a violent act could take place in their own midst. Miss Marple, however, had always believed in the value of observation over speculation. She had already formed a few conclusions, subtle ones, like the small ripples that suggested a much deeper current below the surface. The details others had overlooked were the key to understanding what had really happened at the fete. And one such detail was beginning to tug at the edges of her mind, a clue so faint it could easily be dismissed. But Miss Marple had learned long ago to trust her instincts. The clue, she suspected, lay in the flowers. When Leonard Pippin's body was discovered in the center of the Fates garden, the police had been quick to focus on the immediate cause of death, a stab wound, a violent end. But Miss Marple had noticed something else, something small and seemingly insignificant. The flowers, placed neatly at Leonard's side, their bright colors in stark contrast to the bloodstains beneath them. It was an odd touch, a touch that suggested intention, not chance. The petals were pristine, too perfect to have been crushed. Under the weight of a collapsing body, they were positioned, almost artistically, to create a kind of frame around him. It was as though someone had arranged them there, carefully and deliberately. To some, it might seem like a simple detail, perhaps a coincidence, nothing more than a quirky element of the scene. But to Miss Marple, it suggested something far more deliberate. She had spent the early morning hours quietly speaking to a few of the village's gardeners, inquiring about the types of flowers commonly grown in St. Mary Mead. Many of them were familiar to her, having graced the gardens of her own acquaintances. Roses, peonies, and marigolds were popular, but none of them were particularly unusual. What caught Miss Marple's attention was the mention of a rare flower, an exotic bloom, that grew only in one part of the village, near the Drew estate. It was a night-blooming jasmine, known for its delicate fragrance and its striking white petals that appeared almost translucent in the moonlight. The more Miss Marple thought about it, the more the detail seemed to fit. The flowers at Leonard's side had been white, their petals a shade of pale ivory that glowed in the early evening light. They had been carefully placed, and the fragrance lingered in the air. Could it be that someone had arranged them so precisely for a reason? Miss Marple made her way to the Drew estate shortly after breakfast. The sprawling manor stood just on the outskirts of the village, its grounds impeccably maintained. Basil Drew, the landowner, was well known for his obsession with rare plants, and Miss Marple had heard whispers that he had a particular fondness for night-blooming jasmine. The flowers, so delicate and uncommon, had long been a point of pride for him, a symbol of his wealth and status in the village. The gates to the estate creaked open as Miss Marple approached, and she stepped onto the grounds with the quiet authority of someone who had long been a fixture in the community. She was greeted by a servant who escorted her to the back garden, where she was surprised to find the jasmine growing in abundance. The delicate flowers seemed almost to glow against the dark green foliage, their scent lingering in the air like a promise. "Good morning, Mrs. Drew," Miss Marple called as she approached the patio, where Violet Drew was seated, sipping her tea. She was alone, her sharp features softened by the warmth of the morning sun. "Oh, Miss Marple, how lovely to see you," Violet Drew replied, her tone strained but polite. She offered a tight smile, though there was something about her expression that suggested she was not entirely at ease. "How can I assist you this morning?" "I was admiring your garden," Miss Marple said, nodding toward the jasmine that climbed the walls in thick clusters. "It's quite lovely. I understand these are quite rare, aren't they?" Violet Drew's smile faltered for a moment before she quickly regained her composure. "Oh yes, a prized possession. Basil always takes such good care of them. They're special to him." Miss Marple observed her closely. There was something in the way Violet had answered, the hesitation before she'd spoken. It was as if she were hiding something. But what could it be? "I'm sure he's very proud of them," Miss Marple said. "I imagine the scent is particularly lovely at night, when they bloom. I've heard they can be quite intoxicating." Violet's eyes narrowed slightly, but she gave a small nod. "Yes, well, they're not quite in bloom yet. A few more days, perhaps." Miss Marple smiled gently, the image of the flowers at the fete still fresh in her mind. Of course. But it's interesting, isn't it, how flowers can have such an impact on people. Sometimes the smallest things can make all the difference." Violet Drew looked at her sharply, her hand tightening round the teacup. Miss Marple's casual observation had clearly struck a nerve. It was subtle, but Miss Marple was trained to see these things the way Violet's jaw clenched. the way she immediately looked away, as if to hide the growing discomfort in her eyes. "Afraid I don't understand what you mean, Miss Marple," Violet said, her voice cool but edged with something else, perhaps guilt. "I'm sorry if I've said something inappropriate," Miss Marple said with a warm smile, though her eyes were sharp with insight. "But sometimes a clue can be right in front of us, and we don't even notice it. Just like those flowers." Violet shifted in her seat, her fingers tapping nervously on the porcelain cup. "You're quite right, Miss Marple. You're quite right." Miss Marple stood silently for a moment, studying Violet's face with the patience of someone who knew that time would always reveal the truth. Finally, she spoke again. "Perhaps I should let you get back to your garden, Mrs. Drew. I imagine you've much to do." Violet's face softened with a false smile. "Thank you for stopping by, Miss Marple. It was lovely to chat." As Miss Marple walked away, her mind was working furiously. Violet Drew's discomfort, the connection to the jasmine, the arrangement of the flowers, it all pointed toward something she couldn't yet quite articulate. There was more to Leonard Pippin's death than just a simple stabbing. And somehow Miss Marple knew that the answers lay in the garden, among the flowers that bloomed in the night. There was one thing Miss Marple was sure of now: the jasmine was not the only thing that had been carefully arranged. The days following Miss Marple's visit to Violet Drew's garden passed in a haze of whispering winds and heavy suspicions. The murder of Leonard Pippin, so shocking at first, had started to settle into the village's collective memory like a stain that couldn't quite be scrubbed away. People went about their daily business, but there was a perceptible tension in the air, as if everyone were constantly waiting for something, though no one could say precisely what that something was. Inspector Blakely, as diligent as he was, had made little headway in his investigation. The obvious suspect, as he had originally thought, was Leonard's cousin Richard Pippin. Richard was a bitter man, known throughout the village for his sharp tongue and even sharper temper. He had no love for Leonard, nor did he seem overly bothered by the prospect of inheriting the family estate now that Leonard was gone. But Richard's alibi, though flimsy, had held up, and the police had found no direct evidence linking him to the crime scene. It was this stagnation in the investigation that led Miss Marple to turn her attention more carefully to the people closest to the victim. There was something about Leonard's death that seemed too convenient. Someone had orchestrated a situation in which the blame could be neatly placed on one person, only for that person to be cleared when the time came. Miss Marple had spent the last few days quietly observing the villagers, catching snippets of conversations, and watching the subtle changes in behavior. It was clear to her that more than one person had something to hide, and more than one person had a motive. The first to draw her attention was Mrs. Clarissa Westfield, the local widow, a woman in her late 60s who had lived in St. Mary Mead for decades. She was known for her charitable work, her deep involvement in village activities, and her seemingly endless kindness. But Miss Marple had long suspected that there was more to Mrs. Westfield than met the eye. Her constant involvement in others' business struck Miss Marple as more than mere interest. It was as though Mrs. Westfield was desperately trying to keep attention away from her own past. It wasn't the first time that Miss Marple had found herself wondering about Mrs. Westfield's history, but now, with Leonard Pippin's death hanging over the village, the older woman's behavior seemed more suspicious than ever. Mrs. Westfield had been one of the first to speak out about the murder, offering her thoughts to the police, and like most of the villagers, she had declared her belief that Richard Pippin was the murderer. But Miss Marple had learned to trust the actions of people more than their words, and it was the way Mrs. Westfield had behaved at the fete that lingered in Miss Marple's mind. She'd been one of the first to notice Leonard's body, her shock genuine but slightly exaggerated. Miss Marple had watched her closely from across the garden, noting the sharpness in her eyes when she'd seen Leonard lying dead in the grass. But it was her odd interaction with Violet Drew that had piqued Miss Marple's curiosity even further. On the afternoon of the fete, Miss Marple had observed Mrs. Westfield speaking with Violet Drew near the back of the garden. Their conversation had been quiet, too quiet, and the body language between them was stiff. Violet, typically warm and composed, had appeared visibly uncomfortable in Mrs. Westfield's presence. And Mrs. Westfield, with her usual air of graciousness, had seemed unusually forceful in her tone. That conversation had stuck in Miss Marple's mind. She had no idea what it had been about, but she knew that something important had passed between the two women. What secrets were they sharing? Miss Marple knew that to uncover the truth, she would need to confront Mrs. Westfield directly. She decided to pay her a visit, to see what reaction she could provoke, and whether it might lead her closer to the answer. The following afternoon, Miss Marple made her way to Mrs. Westfield's house, a modest cottage on the outskirts of the village. The house was neat and well kept, with a small garden at the front where a few flowers were blooming, including a patch of bright marigolds. It was a peaceful place, but Miss Marple knew that beneath the calm exterior, there was something far more complex at play. Mrs. Westfield greeted her warmly at the door, though Miss Marple could see the faintest flicker of something in her eyes, a hint of wariness. It was subtle, but it was there. Miss Marple, how kind of you to visit, Mrs. Westfield said, stepping aside to let her in. I do hope you're finding the village to your liking. It's always such a pleasure to visit, Miss Marple replied, her voice light and unassuming. She stepped into the small hallway, glancing around at the neatly arranged furnishings. I've been thinking a great deal about the unfortunate events at the fete. It's such a shock to us all. Mrs. Westfield led her into the sitting room, offering tea and biscuits. As they settled into their chairs, Miss Marple allowed the silence to linger for a moment, watching Mrs. Westfield carefully. The older woman was sitting a little straighter than usual, her hands resting on her lap, fingers drumming lightly on the surface of the armchair. It's dreadful, isn't it? Mrs. Westfield said after a moment. I simply can't believe that poor Leonard is gone. So tragic. And the poor village. It's just not the same, is it? Indeed, Miss Marple replied, her tone mild. I've been wondering, Mrs. Westfield, if you might have seen something at the fete. It's such a strange thing, isn't it? A murder in our quiet little village. Mrs. Westfield's lips twitched. She had obviously been expecting something like this. Well, I've already shared everything I saw with the police, she said, her voice rising slightly, as though to emphasize her point. I've no doubt they'll get to the bottom of it. Miss Marple leaned forward slightly, her eyes never leaving Mrs. Westfield's face. Of course. But sometimes, I've found, it's the smallest detail that can make all the difference. Something that isn't immediately apparent, perhaps. Something we might not notice at first. Mrs. Westfield's smile faltered. She seemed to swallow, her eyes darting toward the window before she answered. I'm afraid I can't think of anything, of any detail that would be of help. Miss Marple's smile was gentle but knowing. You've been so involved in the village, Mrs. Westfield. I'm sure you've heard all sorts of rumors about Leonard's death. It's odd, isn't it, how quickly people form conclusions. But I wonder if all of those conclusions are as accurate as we might think. Mrs. Westfield stiffened, her hand tightening round the teacup. I'm not sure I understand what you mean, Miss Marple. Sometimes, Miss Marple said quietly, The truth is hidden in plain sight, don't you think? We just need to learn how to look for it." A long silence stretched between them, and Miss Marple could feel the tension in the room. Mrs. Westfield's lips parted slightly, as if she were about to say something, but then she closed them again, as if reconsidering. Finally, she stood up abruptly. "I think it's best that we leave it to the police. Miss Marple, thank you for your visit." Miss Marple rose with her, giving Mrs. Westfield a small, understanding nod. Of course, I'm sure you're right. We must let the police do their work." As Miss Marple made her way out of the house, she felt the weight of the conversation settle in her mind. Mrs. Westfield was hiding something, and whatever it was connected to Leonard Pippin's death. But what? Miss Marple walked back down the narrow path leading from Mrs. Westfield's cottage, her mind racing with the conversation she had just had. There was no doubt in her mind now. Mrs. Westfield was hiding something. The way she had reacted to Miss Marple's comments, the nervousness she had barely managed to conceal, everything pointed to a woman whose calm veneer was beginning to crack under pressure. And yet, the real question remained: what was Mrs. Westfield's connection to Leonard Pippin's murder? The thought of the widow's involvement lingered like a puzzle with missing pieces. Miss Marple had learned long ago that human behavior rarely revealed itself all at once. It was a delicate dance, a series of small actions and reactions, and it required an observer who could pick out the slightest change, the faintest shift in tone. Mrs. Westfield's reaction had been too calculated, too guarded. It was then that Miss Marple realized something she hadn't before. She needed to return to the scene of the crime. The village fete, where the murder had occurred, had always been a place of joy and community, a place where every villager had a role to play. And yet it was also a place where masks could be worn, secrets could be hidden. The next morning, after a leisurely breakfast, Miss Marple made her way to the fete grounds once more. It had been nearly a week since Leonard's body had been discovered, but the sense of unease that had settled over the village had not dissipated. Life had returned to a semblance of normalcy. But Miss Marple could sense that something crucial was still being overlooked, something everyone had missed in their rush to point fingers at the obvious suspects. When Miss Marple arrived at the fete grounds, she was struck by the eerie stillness of the place, the vibrant stalls, the colorful ribbons and bunting, all still hung in the trees and along the pathways. But there was no sign of the excitement that had once filled the air. The grounds were silent now, with only a few villagers tending to the remnants of the previous event. It was as if the place itself had absorbed the shock of the murder, its energy drained and replaced with a lingering tension. Miss Marple wandered around, letting her gaze sweep over the scene. The area where Leonard had been found was still cordoned off, though the police had long since finished their investigation. The spot, once alive with laughter and the buzz of conversation, was now an empty, desolate corner of the fete grounds. She stood there for a moment, taking in the scene. Everything appeared as it had before, but Miss Marple knew better than to take things at face value. She was here for a reason, to find that small, elusive detail that everyone else had overlooked. Her eyes swept over the area, focusing on the ground. There, half hidden beneath a small patch of grass, was a glint of something metallic. Kneeling down, Miss Marple carefully brushed the grass aside and discovered a small silver locket. It was delicate, engraved with intricate patterns, and despite the passage of time, it appeared to be in perfect condition. She carefully examined the locket, noting that it had a tiny clasp, the kind that was easily opened with a flick of the finger. When she flipped it open, her sharp eyes caught the faintest trace of an inscription on the inside. It was barely legible, worn with age, but Miss Marple could make out just enough to discern the initials V. Her mind immediately began to churn with possibilities. The locket seemed significant. Was it an heirloom, dropped accidentally during the chaos of the fete? Or had it been deliberately placed here as part of a larger plan? It was the kind of thing that might easily be overlooked by someone not paying attention to the small details, but Miss Marple had learned long ago that these seemingly trivial objects often held the key to unlocking the truth. As she stood up, locket in hand, Miss Marple's thoughts turned to Violet Drew, the one person who had been with Leonard in the moments leading up to his death. Could this locket be hers? And if so, what did it mean? Miss Marple knew that she needed to speak with Violet once again, but this time she would approach her differently. She couldn't simply ask Violet about the locket, for that would reveal too much too soon. No, Miss Marple would need to keep her questions more subtle, drawing out information slowly, bit by bit, until she had the full picture. The next day, Miss Marple made her way to Violet Drew's cottage. It was a cozy, charming home on the outskirts of the village, its gardens overflowing with flowers. As she approached, Miss Marple noticed the slight hesitance in Violet's movements as she opened the door. Violet's face was pleasant, but there was a flicker of something unreadable in her eyes, a wariness that hadn't been there before. Miss Marple, what a surprise, Violet said, her tone warm but strained. To what do I owe the pleasure? I hope I'm not interrupting, Miss Marple replied with a smile. I was just passing through and thought I'd stop by for a chat. I've been thinking a great deal about Leonard's passing. It's been on everyone's minds, hasn't it? Violet nodded, her eyes flickering toward the window as if she were looking for an escape. Yes, quite dreadful. I'm sure we all feel the loss, but the police will sort it out. They always do, don't they? Miss Marple observed Violet closely. Her response was polite, but there was something off about it. Violet was hiding something. But what? I'm sure the police will do their best, Miss Marple said, her voice soft and nonchalant. But sometimes, you know, I've found that it's the smallest things, the most innocent-looking objects, that hold the key to the entire mystery. Violet stiffened, her eyes narrowing ever so slightly. What do you mean by that? Miss Marple smiled gently. Oh, just a thought, my dear. I found something on the fete grounds that made me think. A little silver locket, you see. Very pretty, very delicate. I was wondering if you might know anything about it. It had your initials inside, you know. Violet's face went pale, and for a moment, Miss Marple could see the briefest flicker of panic cross her face, before it was replaced by a mask of calm. I don't know anything about it, Violet said, her voice too tight, too controlled. I'm afraid you must be mistaken. Miss Marple studied her for a long moment, her gaze never leaving Violet's face. The tension in the room was palpable now, and Miss Marple could feel the weight of the unspoken truth pressing down on them both. Miss Marple said, her voice quiet but knowing. Perhaps, but you see, I find it hard to believe that the locket simply appeared there by accident. It seems deliberate. Violet swallowed, her lips trembling slightly as she struggled to maintain her composure. I don't know what you mean, Miss Marple. Oh, I'm sure you don't, Miss Marple said softly. But sometimes, my dear, the things we try to hide are the very things that give us away. Violet's face remained unreadable, but Miss Marple could see the cracks forming beneath the surface. The locket was more than just a trinket, it was a symbol of something much darker, something Violet desperately wanted to keep buried. Sure, you'll tell me when you're ready, Violet, Miss Marple added, her tone light but her eyes sharp. After all, we all have our secrets, don't we? Violet remained silent, her eyes avoiding Miss Marple's gaze. And just like that, Miss Marple knew she was on the right track. The pieces were slowly coming together. But the truth, as always, was hidden behind a veil of carefully constructed lies. It would take time, patience, and careful observation to uncover it. But Miss Marple was nothing if not patient. And she knew that the answers were closer than they seemed. The days had grown colder as autumn settled over the village, painting the countryside in hues of amber and gold. Despite the season's gentle beauty, the air in St. Mary's had become thick with tension. Every passing day brought more whispered rumors and furtive glances, and the once tight-knit community was now frayed at the edges, like an old, well-worn sweater. And through it all, Miss Marple remained steadfast in her quiet observations, her mind ever focused on the delicate threads of the mystery that had unravelled so unexpectedly at the village fete. Miss Marple had learned much in the past few days, but there was still something elusive at the heart of the case. While Violet Drew's reaction to the locket had given her pause, it was not enough to draw any definitive conclusions. There was no question that Violet was hiding something, but what and why had Leonard Pippin's death triggered so many concealed fears in the villagers? No, Miss Marple mused, the solution was still buried beneath layers of half-truths and subtle manipulations. She sat in her favourite chair by the window, looking out over the village square, lost in thought. The locket, now safely tucked into her bag, felt heavy with meaning. What had Violet's involvement been, and what could it reveal about the complex relationships at play? Was Violet the killer, or was she merely an accomplice? And if she were not the murderer, who was the arrival of Inspector Yates that morning had only added to her sense of urgency. The police had made little progress since the initial investigation, their focus still set on the usual suspects, but Miss Marple could see the frustration in the inspector's eyes. He had come to visit her, as he often did, but his visit this time felt different. There was a shadow of doubt in his demeanour, a quiet realization that perhaps they were not looking in the right places. "I must confess, Miss Marple," the inspector said as he settled into the chair across from her, his gaze thoughtful, "I'm at my wit's end. I've gone over every piece of evidence, spoken to everyone who was at the fete that day, and yet something doesn't sit right. I'm afraid we've missed something important." Miss Marple gave him a knowing smile, her eyes twinkling behind her glasses. "Inspector, you mustn't be too hard on yourself. A puzzle like this is never as simple as it appears, and sometimes you have to look past the obvious to see the truth." "I know," Yates replied, his voice tinged with frustration, "but the facts just don't add up. All signs point to Violet Drew, yet there's nothing solid to confirm it. We have her initial reaction to the murder, and the fact that she was seen arguing with Leonard shortly before his death. But she has an alibi. She was in the garden with Mrs. Westfield, and there were others who can vouch for her presence." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully, her fingers drumming gently on the arm of the chair. "Yes, that is a rather curious situation. If Violet is indeed the murderer, it seems she's taken great care to cover her tracks." "Exactly," Yates said. "But then there's the locket. I don't know if you heard, but we found another one just like it in her cottage. It had the same initials inside, and she claimed she knew nothing about the one you found at the fete." "I don't believe her, Miss Marple. There's something she's not telling us." Miss Marple leaned forward slightly, her voice soft but insistent. "Inspector, sometimes, when we look at the evidence, we focus too much on the obvious. But it's the small things, the overlooked details, that can tell us what really happened. What did Violet say when you confronted her about the second locket?" Yates hesitated for a moment, his brow furrowing. "She denied everything. Denied knowing anything about the locket you found. But, Miss Marple, I'm not convinced. I think she's hiding something, and I don't know what it is. Could she be part of something bigger? Is she being controlled by someone else? Miss Marple considered this for a moment. It's a possibility. But if Violet were involved in a conspiracy, why would she go to such lengths to conceal it? If she were truly guilty, she would have known to dispose of both lockets after all. It's not a coincidence that both were found under suspicious circumstances. No, there's something else at play here. Yates was quiet for a moment, his eyes searching Miss Marple's face as if looking for answers that eluded him. Do you have any thoughts, Miss Marple? Anything that might help us make sense of this mess? Miss Marple smiled gently, her voice quiet but confident. I've learned that when a person is hiding something, they often reveal it through their actions, not their words. I think we need to pay closer attention to how people act rather than what they say. Observe them, listen carefully, and the truth will come out. Yates looked at her with a mixture of admiration and frustration. I wish I could think like you, Miss Marple. But I suppose you're right. The truth is often buried beneath the surface, hidden in plain sight. Indeed, Miss Marple replied, her gaze turning thoughtful once more. And I have a feeling we're not as far from the truth as we think. There's something about this case that doesn't sit right with me. Something that links Violet Drew, Mrs. Westfield, and even Leonard Pippin in a way we haven't yet considered. Mrs. Westfield? Yates asked, his eyes narrowing. You think she's involved? Miss Marple's expression was calm, but her eyes were sharp. I believe we should not overlook her. She may be more connected to this crime than we originally thought. After all, she was one of the first people to speak with Violet after the murder, and her behavior since then has been rather peculiar. Yates leaned forward, intrigued. What do you suggest we do, Miss Marple? I think, Miss Marple said, that we need to take a closer look at Mrs. Westfield's past. She's been living in the village for many years, but not much is known about her before she moved here. If we can uncover some old secrets, we may find that her motives are clearer than they appear. Yates nodded slowly, a new determination in his eyes. I'll see what I can find. But what about Violet? Should we press her further? Not yet, Miss Marple replied. Violet will crack in time, but we need to let her think she's in control. People are more likely to reveal themselves when they believe they have the upper hand. With that, Yates stood up, his expression thoughtful. Thank you, Miss Marple. I don't know what we'd do without you. Miss Marple gave a small, modest shrug. I'm sure you'd manage, Inspector. But remember, always trust your instincts. Sometimes, the right answer isn't the one staring you in the face. As Yates left her cottage, Miss Marple sat back in her chair, lost in thought. The pieces were slowly coming together, but there was still much to be done. She could feel that they were nearing the truth. But the last step revealing the murderer would require one final push, one last twist to the puzzle. And she had a feeling that the real killer wasn't far from her reach. It was time to play the final game. The morning air was crisp, with a touch of frost lingering in the shadows of the old village church as Miss Marple made her way to the post office. Her gait, though slow and deliberate, conveyed a sharpness of purpose, the same quiet determination that had made her such a skilled observer of human nature. The events of the past week had only sharpened her resolve. She had spent her days listening, watching, and piecing together fragments of conversations, body language, and subtle reactions, each thread leading her closer to the truth. And yet, the mystery surrounding Leonard Pippin's death was as tangled as ever, the solution still just out of reach. She had taken care to observe everyone in the village since that fateful day at the fete. Violet Drew, of course, and Mrs. Westfield, both of whom had come under suspicion. But the more Miss Marple thought about it, the more she realized how easily the clues could be manipulated. What if she had missed something, some detail that had slipped by unnoticed? Or perhaps, just as likely, what if there was someone else, someone far less conspicuous, hiding in plain sight? She could feel the weight of that thought pressing on her mind as she made her way to the post office. But she pushed it aside for the moment. There was still work to be done, and the answers would come in time. At the post office, Miss Marple exchanged pleasantries with the woman behind the counter, who was, as always, busy sorting the morning's letters. As Miss Marple prepared to leave, the door opened behind her, and she turned to find Violet Drew stepping inside. The woman's face, pale and drawn, betrayed a deep unease. Miss Marple's sharp eyes noted the way Violet looked over her shoulder, as though expecting someone to follow her into the shop. It was a fleeting glance, but it was enough to catch Miss Marple's attention. "Good morning, Miss Drew," Miss Marple said in her gentle, unhurried voice, offering a warm smile. "I trust you're well." Violet gave a small, forced smile in return, though her eyes were troubled. "Good morning, Miss Marple. Yes, well enough, thank you." She paused for a moment, then added, as if the words were escaping her against her will, "I suppose I've come to collect a few things. It's been a bit of a strain lately, as you might imagine." Miss Marple observed her with quiet interest. Violet's nervousness was palpable, but Miss Marple wasn't sure whether it was due to the ongoing investigation or something else. The woman seemed to be keeping something hidden, and Miss Marple could feel that the tension between them was thickening, like the calm before a storm. The silence stretched between them, and Miss Marple decided that now was not the time to press. There was another, more subtle method at her disposal. "I do hope you're taking care of yourself," Miss Marple said, her tone soft but firm. "You've had quite a trying time, I know. Sometimes, when one is under stress, it's easy to overlook the little things that can bring comfort. I've found that taking a walk by the river can do wonders for clearing one's mind." Violet blinked, caught off guard by the suggestion. She seemed to stiffen slightly, then glanced down at the floor, her lips parting as if to speak. But before she could respond, the door opened once more, and Mrs. Westfield entered, her tall figure and impeccable posture a sharp contrast to Violet's more dishevelled appearance. The two women exchanged a brief, awkward glance, and Miss Marple saw Violet's posture tighten further. "Good morning, Mrs. Westfield," Miss Marple greeted her, her voice still soft but with a noticeable shift in tone. "How are you today?" Mrs. Westfield smiled, though her eyes betrayed a hint of calculation, as if weighing her response. "Quite well, thank you, Miss Marple," she said smoothly, before turning to Violet. "Violet, my dear, you seem a bit out of sorts this morning. Is everything all right?" Violet forced a smile, but it was clear she was uncomfortable under Mrs. Westfield's scrutiny. "I'm fine," she said quickly, then turned her attention to Miss Marple. I've just been thinking about the fate, about everything that happened. It's all so strange, isn't it?" Miss Marple let the silence linger before answering. "Yes, indeed. So many things are left unexplained. But, as always, the truth has a way of coming to light, even when we least expect it." Violet's eyes darted, nervously, her lips pressing into a thin line. It was only for a moment, but Miss Marple caught it. The flicker of guilt, or was it fear, that crossed Violet's face before she quickly composed herself. "It's just, well, I suppose we're all still reeling from the shock," Violet murmured. "I don't know how to make sense of it all." Mrs. Westfield gave a sympathetic smile, though it lacked warmth. "It's a dreadful thing, to be sure. But you mustn't let it consume you, Violet. There are people in the village who are much more invested in this than you are. "You've been through enough already." Miss Marple observed the two women, noting their exchange with interest. There was something off about their dynamic, something that felt forced, as though they were both playing a role. She had no evidence yet, no concrete reason to suspect either one of them directly, but Miss Marple's intuition told her that both women were hiding something. She didn't believe in coincidences, and the fact that both Violet and Mrs. Westfield were in the post office at the same time, engaging in a conversation about Leonard Pippin's murder, was too curious to be dismissed. "I do believe I've kept you both long enough," Miss Marple said, her voice light but purposeful. "I won't keep you from your errands." With a final glance between them, Miss Marple turned and left the post office, the morning air hitting her with a rush of coldness. She walked slowly back toward her cottage, her mind racing. It was becoming clearer to her now Violet Drew was not as innocent as she had first appeared. The way she had reacted when Miss Marple suggested a simple walk by the river, the way her eyes had flickered when she'd been in Mrs. Westfield's presence, all pointed to something more. But what had Violet done? And how did Mrs. Westfield fit into all of this? The puzzle pieces were starting to fall into place, but there was still something elusive about it all. Back at her cottage, Miss Marple sat down by the fire, the warmth enveloping her as she began to sift through her thoughts. She was no closer to understanding the full truth, but she knew this: the secrets of St. Mary's were buried deep, and the villagers had no intention of letting them slip out easily. But Miss Marple was patient. She had spent a lifetime observing human nature, and she knew that, eventually, the truth would surface, perhaps, in the most unexpected of ways. Tomorrow, she thought, tomorrow, she would push a little harder. She would meet with Violet again, and this time, she would see if the woman could be made to reveal her hand. And in the quiet of the firelight, Miss Marple allowed herself the smallest of smiles. The game was afoot. The days had passed in a quiet, unsettling march, each moment stretching longer than the last, as the village of St. Mary's remained on edge. The fate was a distant memory, but its shadow lingered over the village like an unshakable fog. The investigation into Leonard Pippin's death had taken many turns, with suspects coming and going, each one as likely as the next, and yet the truth had remained stubbornly out of reach. But Miss Marple knew, she had always known, that the final pieces were close to falling into place. She sat in her small sitting room, the fire crackling softly, casting long shadows on the walls. The quiet ticking of a clock on the mantel was the only sound that accompanied her thoughts as she stared into the flames. The puzzle was nearly solved now, and all that remained was to make the final connections. She had spent the past few days observing, quietly noting the behaviors of the people in the village, and today something had finally clicked. It was time to confront the truth. The villagers had gathered in the local pub for the weekly evening gathering, a ritual that had not changed for as long as anyone could remember. Miss Marple had been invited to join, of course, though she had no intention of partaking in their idle chatter. No, this evening was for something else, something far more important. She arrived at the pub just as the evening fog began to settle over the village, her steps measured and deliberate. Inside, the usual crowd had gathered, their conversations rising and falling in a casual hum. Violet Drew and Mrs. Westfield were already seated at a table near the fire, engaged in quiet conversation. As Miss Marple entered, the room fell into a brief hush before the murmur of voices resumed. Miss Marple made her way to a corner table, where she could observe without being too conspicuous. Her sharp eyes swept the room, noting the way that villagers had arranged themselves, some seated with friends, others in quiet groups, but always with an undercurrent of tension. They were all watching one another, as if waiting for the final act to unfold. It was only a matter of time before Miss Marple could draw the thread that would unravel everything. The door opened, and a familiar figure stepped inside. Inspector Evans, who had been overseeing the investigation, stood for a moment in the doorway, his eyes scanning the room before settling on Miss Marple. He nodded politely in her direction before joining her at the table. "Good evening, Miss Marple," the inspector greeted her, his voice low. "I trust you're well as can be expected, Inspector," Miss Marple replied, her tone light but her eyes sharp. "I'm sure you've made much progress on the case, haven't you?" Evans sighed, lowering his voice further. "Progress, yes, but not the kind I'd hoped for. Everyone seems to have a different theory, and the evidence is, well, it's circumstantial at best. The more I look into it, the more confused I become. I can't seem to tie it all together." Miss Marple gave a small, knowing smile. "The key, Inspector, is not in the evidence alone. It lies in understanding the people involved, their motivations, their behaviors, and the hidden dynamics that govern them. You must look at the relationships, not the facts on paper." Evans raised an eyebrow but said nothing, clearly intrigued by her words. He had learned, over the course of many cases, that Miss Marple's insight often outstripped that of even the most seasoned investigators. He waited patiently as she took her time, her gaze drifting back to the group near the fire. "Violet, Drew, and Mrs. Westfield," Miss Marple began, her voice soft but steady. "They are central to this mystery, you know. Both of them have something to hide." Evans leaned in slightly, his interest piqued. "I've suspected as much," he said, "but there's no concrete evidence linking them to Leonard's death. What do you think they know?" Miss Marple paused, her eyes narrowing slightly as she observed the two women. "Violet, in particular, has been nervous. It's subtle, but it's there. She's been trying to distance herself from the other villagers, as though she's afraid of being found out. And Mrs. Westfield, she's been far too composed, too calm. It's as though she's playing a role, one that she's very careful not to break." Evans frowned, his brow furrowing as he processed her words. "But what's the connection? Why would they have any reason to kill Pippin?" Miss Marple leaned back in her chair, her fingers lightly tapping the edge of her cup. "That, Inspector, is the question we need to answer. The answer lies not in what happened at the fete, but in what happened long before." At that moment, the door opened again, and a tall man entered the pub, his features set in a grim expression. He scanned the room quickly before making his way over to the table where Miss Marple and Evans sat. It was George Drew, Violet's husband. "I'm sorry to interrupt," he said quietly, his voice low but with a note of urgency. "But I believe I have some information that might help with the case." Evans stood up immediately, his expression hardening as he faced George. "What do you know about the murder, Drew?" George hesitated, looking over at Violet before answering. "It's not what you think. I didn't want to get involved in this, but now I see I have no choice. It's about Violet. She's been hiding something. She was with Pippin the night he died." Violet's face drained of color at the mention of her name, and Miss Marple watched closely as her hands clenched tightly in her lap. Mrs. Westfield, who had been listening intently, stiffened as well, her eyes narrowing. "Why didn't you come forward with this earlier?" Evans demanded, his voice sharp. I didn't want to cause trouble," George said, his voice shaking. But Violet had been acting strange. She said she was at home the night of the fete, but I know that's not true. She was seen with Pippin, alone, and I believe she knew something about his death. Violet's eyes darted nervously between her husband and the others, but she said nothing. Miss Marple could see the strain on her face, the guilt written plainly in her expression. Miss Marple stood slowly, her eyes locking with Violet's. The truth has a way of finding its way to the surface, doesn't it, Miss Drew? Violet swallowed hard, her breath coming in shallow gasps. I didn't mean for any of this to happen, she whispered, her voice cracking. Pippin had found out about a secret I'd kept hidden for years, a secret about my past, and he was going to tell everyone. He was going to ruin me. That's the truth, then, Miss Marple said softly, but with quiet authority. The motive was fear. Fear of exposure. Violet, you were the one who killed Leonard. Pippin. But it wasn't a crime of passion. It was a crime of desperation. Violet crumpled under Miss Marple's gaze, her shoulders shaking with the weight of her confession. I never meant to hurt anyone. But I was terrified, and when Pippin threatened to tell everyone about what I had done, I couldn't let that happen. Miss Marple nodded, her face serene but resolute. We all have our secrets, Miss Drew, but some secrets, when left unchecked, can lead to the most tragic consequences. As the truth of Violet's crime unfolded, the tension in the room dissolved, and the villagers slowly began to understand the complex web of lies, fear, and regret that had led to Leonard Pippin's death. The pub grew quiet as Miss Marple's words settled in, her wisdom and insight finally bringing the case to a close. As for Violet, she was led away in silence, her life forever changed by the weight of her own actions. The village would go on, of course, returning to its quiet rhythms. But the shadow of Leonard Pippin's death would linger in the hearts of those who had been touched by it. Miss Marple, as always, would remain composed, her thoughts turning inward as she reflected on the nature of human beings. Secrets, she knew, were a part of everyone's life. But in the end, the truth would always find its way to the light. And with that thought, Miss Marple returned to her quiet cottage, content, in the knowledge that justice had been done, even if the road to it had been long and fraught with darkness.